Hello, I'm Stuart Childs and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Now that the date for peak cover on farms has passed, I spoke with John McCabe, Teagasc Aurivo Joint Programme Group Facilitator and Monitor Farm Advisor, and I started by asking John, now that we have passed peak, what way are things looking in the west and what are the learnings from the autumn build-up of 2022?
The key learning for me is that if the stocking rate on the milking platform is anywhere near 3 or above 3 cows to the hectare, the herd needs to be fed something in August or early September to have grass in the latter half of October. I did a bit of analysis on all farms measuring grass across the Aurivo catchment area around this time last month, around the 12th of September. And about 3/4 of farms had failed to build up at that stage, even though we were getting normal growth rates. So I think we've had favourable growing conditions in the meantime, so the situation is better than it was, and farmers have probably reacted to the fact that they were low on grass supply and put in some feed over the last month. So I think farms have reacted well. But the key learning for me for the autumn build-up this year, Stuart, is that if you want grass in the latter half of October and you have a medium to high stocking rate on the platform, you're going to have to feed something, whether that's silage, whether it's zero grazed grass, or whether it's extra concentrates. Some form of supplement would have had to go in August, September time.
Okay, and I suppose you're saying that even though you were kind of ahead of the game relative to where we were in the south at the time, but just the fact that things were kind of going normally, there wasn't a conscious effort being made to actually increase grass available on the platforms. Is that it?
Whatever the circumstances were, about 1 in 10 farms had an average farm cover of above 1,000. And 1 in 4 farms had an average farm cover above 900. So whatever the circumstances were, we just hadn't built grass. And I think, look, ground conditions were great. And the way I see it up the west of Ireland here is that some autumns can be quite difficult in terms of autumn grazing. Not that it doesn't happen at all, but it can be a battle at times due to the heavy soil type in places. However, I'd see this year would be different because August and September were great months, and I suppose maybe farmers reacted a week or 10 days later when they saw that oh look, ground conditions are good. So yeah, I think it has kind of balanced out. However, I'd still say there are some farms that are low on grass supply as we talk now in the middle of October. And they're going to have certain things that they're going to need to think about over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, so look, we had better growing conditions than down south, definitely. I still have I'm still connected to a lot of farmers down south on my pasture based account, and I can see that they've actually recovered well enough in a lot of cases too. So growth has been good, basically, is the key message in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose moving on from the trying to build scenario, and looking at the closing, so where we are now right at this moment in time, have farms started to close in the region, and if so, what date have they started closing, or what kind of are you finding a bit of resistance maybe to closing, seeing as you're talking about good ground conditions?
Typically, what we see on any farm that isn't, say, on the drier, free draining soils up here is that it's ground conditions that put people into the shed rather than grass supply. So we may have a little bit of a battle on our hands this year if ground conditions stay good, because as we might talk about in a minute, we need the grass for the spring. So, but yeah, people have started close. We're kind of about a week into closing, I would say, on average. Some people start around the 1st of October, and others kind of around from the 5th to the 10th of October onwards. But in reality, if we think about closing up the farm, the only time we know what date we started closing is when the cows are fully housed. I suppose that doesn't take away from the fact that we need a plan put in place, and the major plan is that we need to have between 60 and 70% of the milking platform grazed by the end of this month, and maybe on the heavier soils that we'd be aiming for 80%. So I would see the fact that growing conditions have been good in the last couple of weeks. There are some heavy covers out there, and if we're going to be able to get through these heavy covers and get the farm closed up, we need to reduce supplement if we have a lot of grass out there. So no silage in the diet, and don't be going in with high levels of meal, basically, so that we can get through these heavy covers and keep moving around the farm and closing. One of the other things that I have started to notice is that silage tends to go in at this time of year when just the evenings are dark. The roads maybe start to get a little bit sloppy, and maybe that switches something on in our heads that this is the time for silage. I don't know, but I think when we're trying to close our farms and when it's wetter, having silage in the diet just takes the appetite off the cows, and cleanouts can suffer because of that.
And I suppose, what factors are you finding? We'll say you mentioned it there now about ground conditions pushing in people into the sheds, but are there any other factors that are influencing the closing date?
Yeah, so look, there's two of the main factors I would see that influence people closing up would be the demand for grass in the spring. So if there's a lot of mouths going out grazing in February, maybe a lot of cows calving quickly, and there's a good appetite of the farmer to get out to grass in the spring. They're the main things that I would say drive the people to close, quite astutely in October. If there isn't such an appetite to get out to grass in the spring, it's kind of we'll graze until we can, which is probably not the advice that we would be giving. Look, there are other things that I would think influence closing, and having proper grazing infrastructure is obviously going to be key to making it easy to do in the autumn. So easy to graze in the autumn, easy to graze in the spring will mean that people are more, I suppose, in tune with trying to have enough grass there for the spring. So
you're saying there basically that if the farm is well set up and grazing is easier, people are more inclined to create the scenario where they can go graze in the springtime, whereas if it's trickier, they're probably inclined to let them run, is it?
Yeah, exactly. And so take a year like this where ground conditions are good. We had a dry August, September. That would mean typically that ground conditions are way better than they would be in another year at this day of the year. So people might be tempted to graze on, and that would mean if people graze on, in effect, they're basically starting to close later, because they're going to be coming back around onto a paddock that might have been grazed on the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th of October. If they can graze that at the start of November, and ground conditions allow them to do, and they might not have an appetite for keeping enough grass for the spring, they might graze it. So we need to try and avoid that, and the way to do that is have a plan in place that we're going to try and have 70% of the farm or 80% of your farm graze for the 1st of November, and then make the decision at the end whether you should graze your last 2 or 3 paddocks or leave them.
Like you've kind of said it there a little bit already, but on the wetter soils, or we'll say soils maybe that are getting more rainfall maybe as opposed to maybe being wetter soils, but along the western seaboard there, are ye approaching closing any differently? Like you mentioned there, maybe trying to graze 80% in October for heavier farms now. And I know Emma Louise has spoken to Danny Birmingham before there now, who's obviously in Clare there and on a very wet spot there, and he's trying to basically graze out the entire farm in October. Have you people that are falling into that category?
We do, yeah. And I just was talking to a few farmers dotted around the province, and one guy up in Mayo said ground is good enough and grass is growing well, but typically things can turn really quickly. So he's trying to get through as much of the grass as he can in October and have as flat a wedge as possible. Another guy in Sligo is saying that ground is getting sticky on the wet parts, but that there's plenty of grass around, is just trying to utilize it. And just lastly, I was talking to a couple of guys up in Donegal where they were saying ground conditions are great for the time of year, but they're still just trying to get through basically 80% of the farm for the 1st of November. And if they get any grazing done in November, it's kind of bonus territory just due to the soil type and the fact that it can turn quickly. And I suppose it comes back to the age-old adage that you need to be flexible in the shoulders of the year, in the spring and in the autumn. And the flexibility that we're talking about at the minute is how much supplement you have in. Can you get through your area? Are you going to stop grazing in time? Will you have to go in back fencing? And in a lot of cases, people haven't had to do much back fencing yet, which is a fair enough indicator that it's a good autumn so far.
And I suppose the other thing that you're saying there as well, obviously, so is that even though ground conditions are very good, those guys that you've been talking to will say are still going to go ahead with the same plan. And like if ground conditions are good, there's a chance that growth may actually be better than they might be expecting. So they may even get to come back again in November and pick off one of those first paddocks, as you said there earlier, just being driven by actual average farm cover rather than actual date.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I've just started to notice in the last kind of week to 10 days that the odd farm has built too much grass. And if the mouths aren't there to eat it, i.e. if the stocking rate is 2.8 or below and average farm covers are at 1,300 or above, they could be a bit slow getting around on their closing plan now for the next couple of weeks, which could end up in an extremely uneven wedge there next year. So if they stop grazing in time with the right average farm cover to hit their target on the 1st of December, but they could have a couple of covers that are at 2,000 going into the winter, which isn't ideal. So just need to be dynamic and flexible going into the winter. I suppose one of the other things, Stuart, is we're coming into a time of year now, the second half of October, where we need to be thinking about setting up our farm for February. And really what we're thinking about is grazing in April, which is funny to be thinking about at this time of year in October. But if we want to start our second rotation in time in 2023, we need to be able to have enough grazing done early on in the spring next year. So typically, if people start closing up their driest fields, their best access fields too early, it can be hard to get through area in February, because an early closed paddock is going to have your heaviest cover over the winter. If we have a heavy cover on our easy access paddock, I'm thinking a paddock with a roadway on two sides, multiple access, dry, closer to the yard. If that's closed too early, we might have a small amount of cows calved in February. Trying to go out and eat a heavy cover, we could be in and out of that paddock 8-10 times, not get through much area, do a bit of damage, and that can slow us down in terms of starting our second rotation. So we need to be a bit more, we need to start really, really focusing on a couple of paddocks for next February.
So you're covering a big area there. You're covering all of Connacht basically, and even going into Leinster as well as Donegal in the north. And you did a lot. You were covering a big area down here in the south when you were down here with the Dairy Gold program as well a couple of years ago. So you've seen a lot of different approaches. Now you mentioned flexibility as well. Is there anything else that you've noticed, we'll say, on your travels that you see as being an important point in terms of trying to manage grazing for the last rotation to set yourself up for the spring? Like,
yeah, so I would think that you really, really need to pick out a couple of these paddocks for February. 3 or 4 paddocks, or maybe even up to 5 or 6 paddocks, depending on what size your paddocks are. But they need to be picked out, and you need to target grazing them from the 20th of October onwards, for about 10 days to 2 weeks after that. Because if we work out our growth rates over the winter, a paddock closed on the 5th or the 10th of October is going to have 1,400, 1,500 of a cover or more by the time you want to start grazing in February, and it's going to be too slow trying to get through it. Cows are just going to be after calving with depressed appetites, so we want to be putting cows onto covers of kind of 700 to 1,000 when we start grazing in the spring. So really, you can have a really, really good plan for closing up the farm. You can get really complicated and try and pick a paddock here, a paddock there, a paddock now, a paddock in 2 weeks, paddock in a couple of weeks. But really, for me, it's them couple of paddocks that we're going to be starting off with in February are the really, really priority ones for grazing on the 20th of February to the kind of 1st to the 5th of November, that kind of period.
So just focus on making sure that you're okay for February, and like the rest of it will fall into place is kind of what you're suggesting there.
I think so, because
you can overcomplicate it. Maybe
you could overcomplicate it, and growth rates could come either very, very good or very poor, and your plan is 2 weeks out. So if we can just try and focus on them February paddocks.
Yeah, very good advice there, in fairness. So I suppose, look, you're talking there about having been talking to some of the lads across the territory and so forth, and obviously they're lads that are switched on, they're willing to do this, like your lads in Donegal now that are going to graze 80%, and they'll be ready to go to the shed maybe in November, at very early in November regardless, kind of. But is it a challenge to get the majority of farmers to close up? You're doing a good few groups up there in the west as well, and like no different to down the south as well. Is it a challenge to get guys to close, and especially when like autumn is so good as well? And why do you think it is such a challenge, given that we talk about it all the time, every year after year, we talk about close, and yet we end up with fellas that have no grass in the springtime because they kept going?
Okay, so yeah, it can be a challenge, and as I referred to earlier on, if ground conditions are good, we can have a battle on our hands to stop people grazing. I think most farmers, by and large, at this stage, have a date in their head for starting to close in the autumn. What we know from trials in Moore Park and Mike Egan's trials is that some years we should probably start closing up the 28th of September if the growth conditions are poor and it doesn't grow much in October. And then some other years, sometimes it might have been the 7th or 8th of October should be the ideal start of closing date. But really and truly, most farmers have a set date in their head, and they'll start from there. So I suppose, look, if ground conditions put people into the shed, typically there will be enough grass in the spring if people have a set date. But if ground conditions are good, the temptation could be there to graze off another 2 or 3 paddocks, which could really, really drop our grass supply in the spring, and we know all the disadvantages of that. I think one of the things I've noticed up in the last couple of years, Stuart, is that if we have poor grazing infrastructure on certain parts of the farm, i.e. silage ground that has come back in, that could actually end up being left until the spring, which sometimes gets people out of a hole if there's a dry period to graze it in March. But by and large, I think we have a set date for closing, and ground conditions typically put people into the shed. But look, as 2 or 3 farmers have said to me in groups in the last couple of weeks, when things get sticky here, it happens fast, and typically that happens around the end of this month.
So I suppose finally, John, can you summarise the importance of closing the farm correctly in the autumn in a sentence?
Well, sure. The grass we graze in the spring is growing in October. That's number one. If I was to put it into 2 sentences, Stuart.
Okay, I'll give you that one.
If we were to put it into 2 sentences, I would say the grass that we graze in the spring is growing in October, and the grass that we graze in February is growing from the 20th of October to the 5th of November. So that needs to be the February paddock.
Okay, and actually, I'm just after thinking of one as well there that Fergal O'Mahony that works with us often says as well, a day in the autumn is worth 10 in the spring as well when it comes to grazing grass. So it's one that might, those couple of sentences might trigger it for people that they need to start shutting the gate basically. So we'll leave it at that, John. Thanks a million for coming on and talking to me today, and we wish everybody up the west and all across the country all the best with getting their closing strategy right. And I suppose key taking from today, in your opinion, is not to overcomplicate that closing strategy and target to get some of those paddocks that are easily accessible, that are going to have the appropriate cover for those early calved cows in February, organised and grazed off between the 20th and the end of October, and maybe the early part of November as well, to make sure that they're right and they're accessible obviously in the springtime, and then the rest of it within reason can fall into place as such, is it?
Exactly.
Thanks very much, John. We'll talk to you again. Take care.
Anytime.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Age podcast, and thanks to John McCabe for joining us on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join me next time for your Dairy Age.